Welcome to today's Thrice of Medieval, and we have a real treat today in our special guest, who is Matthew Harffy, author of the Bernicia Chronicles. He's also just started a new series, A Time for Swords, that starts with the Viking invasion of Lindisfarne, which is a fabulous, I think there's 2 novels in that series now. So without further ado, let's welcome Matthew Harffy. Matthew, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, Matthew.
Hello, Derek.
Let's start off. Let's take you back to when you first started writing the Bernicia Chronicles. It's set in Northumberland. It's set in the 7th century, before the Vikings, before Alfred the Great even. Why that period and why that particular area?
The simple answer is it's sort of a bit random, really, but I guess it was as a result of different things. Looking back, I can understand, why I ended up falling into that sort of place. And I guess the time specifically was because I saw a documentary in 2001 on television called Meet the Ancestors, and they were in Bamborough Castle, or just south of Bamborough Castle, and there was a burial ground there in the dunes, or near the dunes near Bamborough Castle, within sight of the castle. And they'd dug up lots of skeletons, and some of these dated back to the 7th century. And they talked about Bernicia and how Bamborough Castle, as it was known, Bebbanburg at the time, was the seat of the kings of Bernicia, which became the northernmost part of Northumbria later on in history. And so that was why that period, I think it just something about that documentary kind of sparked my interest. But the reason I think it sparked my interest, especially in that area, was because I'd lived for a few years as a kid in Northumberland, on the banks of the Tweed.
Oh yeah.
In a little village called Norham, and I'd been to Bamborough Castle a few times, so I knew the area, and I'd loved the sort of coastline of Northumberland, and so I felt some affinity with the place. And the time just became interesting to me. I knew nothing about it back then in sort of 2001, but I just started writing and then started researching and realizing there was this whole period of history that was very underrepresented in fiction and even in the history books, really, as far as I could see, in any great detail. And so I just started writing, and then things happened, and that I ended up sort of falling into that period, really.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I mean, the area, it's a fabulous area. A nice area to go to research as well.
Yeah, I haven't done a lot of research in person in Northumberland over the years. I mean, I sort of relied a lot on my memories and in other research, but I've recently, this year, or last year, 2022, I've been twice up to that neck of the woods, and it's been great, actually, revisiting some of the places that I remember fondly, and also that I've researched so closely as well over the years. So it's been great going back to Lindisfarne and in Bamborough, and I went to Norham as well, and the Tweed, and it was brilliant.
As you said, it's an underrepresented area of history as well, what has always been called the Dark Ages. How dark did you find it? How difficult was it to research?
Well, very dark. I think, in fact, I've written a few articles over the years and for blog posts and things about the term the Dark Ages. And I know that historians hate it, and now it's called the early medieval. But I think the term the Dark Ages is actually pretty good, because I've argued the case for the term the Dark Ages for different reasons. But I think the lack of history of really contemporary history, written down at the time is part of that. So there's a real darkness in terms of actually knowing exactly what happened and to whom and where, and lots of that is up for grabs. We don't really know. I mean, things have been discovered all the time, archaeology and things, but
yeah,
there are a lot of gaps in what I could find out, and the real detail, as far as I could work out, really was only there's stuff in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is very scant. It's just a few lines here and there, and it was written a couple of centuries later as well, at least. But it's things like, Oswald had a battle against Penda at somewhere, and that's it, and Penda won, or Oswald won, or whatever. That you don't really get much more than that.
No.
And then you've got the Venerable Bede, who was writing only a few decades later, and he does write in quite a lot of detail about some of the events, but obviously it's all very skewed from the perspective of the Christian church, and looking at how the events can be explained by the grace of God and things like that. So it's quite a one-sided conversation.
Yeah.
So those are the two sources that I relied on most, really. I would look at, for the Bernicia Chronicles, look at Bede and then the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and then write around those main sort of events and take them as read, that they were true as well. So I decided early on that I would decide that what Bede said was true, and those things had largely happened. So even when he talks about miracles and things, I thought, well, maybe I can explain those things away, but maybe I don't need to. But they definitely believed that those things happened, and so I can, and when he says there was certain events and battles and things, I would try to incorporate those as much as I could into the story.
Yeah.
But the rest of the time, being such a dark period in terms of the lack of history, it meant I could make up good stories around what we do know.
You should try the 5th century. That's even harder.
I imagine it is. Yeah.
I had a reviewer once who said, I would have liked more about the actual history of the period, to which I replied, so would I.
Yeah.
Because there isn't any. No, very difficult period to research.
Does the scarcity of sources mean you have free reign, or do you feel obliged to actually work out what might have happened and what the most plausible outcome would have been? Or do you just think, I'll just go with it, they don't tell me, so I can just make it up?
A bit of both, I think. I think it's definitely, I was going to say it's definitely a plus. I think it makes it easier in some ways to write about the period, because once I've done some research, if it's a picture, you can imagine a painting, it's kind of like the broad brushstrokes are there from the sources, but the rest of all the detail I can sort of pencil in and scratch in. But I'll try and I'll look at what people have written about things and what archaeology there is, and try to come up with the most plausible location for a battle, for example. But then it's the question of why do they end up there? So there's a battle, Mesa Field, which supposedly, according to many people, took place in Oswestry, because Oswestry comes from the term Oswald's tree. Oswald is defeated there and apparently stuck on a tree or whatever. But I decided, after lots of sort of research and reading around the subject and looking at the different options, that it didn't make a huge deal of sense that the battle would be there. And so I moved it somewhere else. And I'm not the first person to think it wasn't there. Lots of people have posited other ideas and other locations. So I'll look at things like that, and because you've got to come up with a reason in the book for why do the characters end up in that location.
Yeah.
If it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, then I'll have to come up with a solution that does make sense. So it didn't seem to make a huge lot of sense for Oswald to be probing deep into the Mercian territory, almost into Wales. So I decided to move the battle and have the Mercians attacking into Northumbria.
Yeah, it makes sense, and it worked.
Yeah, well, I mean, hopefully it works. I mean, interestingly enough, I've had nobody write back to me and say that it's total rubbish. Often you get people writing and saying, well, I totally disagree with this decision you've made or whatever. You sort of read a lot about that happening to authors, but in that case, about the location of that battle, nobody's written to me and said that they disagree with me, so I'm happy with that. I think it was the monks in Oswestry some sort of few hundred years later that decided that it was a good way of revenue stream for them to say that Oswald had died there in the sort of later medieval period.
You find that a lot. It's like the monks at Glastonbury finding King Arthur and Guinevere just when they needed some money.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's most surprising to me is that how many modern historians or history books just basically just take it as read and just go, oh, well, it must have happened here because we've got this place called Oswestry. So we're just going to say that this battle took place there, because they don't know, because we don't know, because the name Maserfield doesn't exist anymore. So we don't know. So the names that are in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and in Bede don't relate to a modern place. It's very difficult to pinpoint.
Yeah, that can be annoying.
Yeah, but I think overall the scarcity of sources is a good thing. I think it means I have to do some sort of mental agility to try and work out, how to thread things together to make the story work. But at the same time, it does give me more free reign, as long as it sort of makes sense.
So what is the most difficult aspect of writing in the early medieval historical landscape?
Well, if you're talking about the physical landscape of the medieval period, then that's one thing. If you're talking about sort of a metaphorical landscape, I suppose that's something different. But I can answer both probably. The physical landscape is quite difficult in terms of the actual land has just changed a lot. So obviously it's very difficult to understand what things would have looked like, what Britain would have looked like, or what any place would have looked like. Rivers have moved, the coastline has changed, forests have changed, the types of trees have changed, the types of animals that we have roaming around have changed. Buildings obviously have appeared out of nowhere, bridges and things. So all of that is a real challenge. But I think trying to actually imagine, and obviously researching as well, but looking back and trying to work out, there was a Roman bridge here at some point, but my books are set a couple of hundred years after the Romans. Was the Roman bridge still there? Obviously the modern day bridges weren't there. There's a medieval bridge built in the 14th century or something. What happened in between the Roman bridge and the 14th century bridge, and trying, things like that, trying to sort of, maybe the information isn't there and I have to kind of just use my intuition or a bit of common sense or whatever, and try and work out what people have done in the meantime. But I find that interesting, and I do a lot of research about the what native trees there were at the time, because I often read in historical fiction people mentioning animals or trees that didn't exist at the time, and it rubs me up the wrong way. Because the information's out there, so it's just a case of lack of research, really, that they haven't gone to that level of detail. And obviously, I'll have made mistakes and got things wrong. So, I mean, I'm sure there's things that I've written that people will be reading, thinking, "Oh, if only he's got that wrong." And in terms of the sort of the historical, political landscape or whatever else we mean by sort of the historical landscape, I think the difficulty really of that is just understanding how people thought and the interaction between different peoples and different religions and different countries. And I don't think humans have changed very much over the years. In fact, probably not at all. But our outlook to things and the way people interact and the way people think of things have. And I'm pretty sure if we wrote something in a way that was 100% authentic to the times that I'm writing about, it would be quite unpalatable to a modern reader.
Yeah.
So it's getting a balance of what feels real, what feels authentic, and what also will work for a modern reader, I think, is kind of difficult.
Yeah.
Because you have to find something that's interesting to everybody, don't you? And the way Beerbrand travels to various places and things, that would have been unusual in those times. Most people would have stayed in their respective villages and never gone more than 20 miles in either direction. But luckily Beerbrand's a warrior and a good one, so he gets sent off on missions and things.
Absolutely. And it's an interesting thing, because you often see, it's a very modern take on this. You often see lots of archaeologists and historians talking now about how Britain wasn't very isolated. There was lots of travel between, there was people coming from all over the place, and people come from Turkey and from the south of Spain and from Africa and all over the place. And we traded with all these places. And it's true that obviously some people had come from all of these places. And there's, been bones found and of people from different locations in the British Isles. And also people from the British Isles have been found to have been buried in faraway places, and also lots of trade goods that we know have come from all over the place. But the reality is, and I think this modern conversation implies that everybody was traveling around all over the place. I think the reality is that was like 1% or even smaller number of people that were traveling around. I don't think very many people were traveling around, because we know, I mean, even looking back less than 100 years, people didn't travel very far, even within our lifetimes. And we didn't have this sort of multi-ethnic world that we live in now. And people were very isolated and insular. And I think it's interesting to kind of get that balance and make it interesting to have the characters travel around more widely, as you say, and still keep it plausible.
Yeah, I loved the way you did in Forest of Foes. You've got Beerbrand on his band travelling to France, and of course Beerbrand can't speak French or whatever they spoke then in those days for French.
Yeah.
And I love the way he learns it throughout the book. Because I remember I lived in France for 6 months and I was exactly the same. You go there with very little confidence and it builds up as you go.
Well, I'm glad you. I think you're the only reviewer that's picked up on that. But I think that's part of the way I think is I try to think of the reality of the situation, and even then it's simplified because, as you say, what language did they speak? There were multiple languages spoken in France, just as there were multiple dialects of different languages spoken in Britain at the time. And I put in the note at the end that I've decided to say they all speak a single language, or at least everybody from all the regions of Francia can understand each other, because otherwise it just becomes too complex. But I do think about having someone who can actually translate, because otherwise it just doesn't make any sense. Beerbrand, a guy born and brought up in Kent, who then travels to Northumbria and lives most of his life there, traveling to France, wouldn't suddenly be able to communicate with the French. I mean, he can't read or write or anything, so he's definitely not educated enough to be able to. I mean, he could pick up the language if he lived there. Obviously, he's not an idiot, but
Yeah.
he does. Throughout the book, he picks up some words and he learns a few bits and pieces. The same way as if you went on holiday to a foreign country for a few weeks, you might learn how to order a few beers or whatever. That's kind of the level of his language. But I lived in Spain for many years, and of course I went through the process of learning a foreign language. And obviously I know you can learn a foreign language and get bilingual and get fluent in it, but it takes time and a certain level of natural aptitude as well. So I've got in the other series, in the Hunlaf books, the Time for Swords series, the third one is a day of reckoning, which I'm just editing now, actually. And in that, Hunlaf goes down to Islamic Spain, and he's picked up some of the language. I've had to explain that in the intervening couple of years between A Night of Flames and A Day of Reckoning, he's been basically having language lessons from an Islamic thrall who's in his band, who's been basically teaching him. But Hunlaf is a monk, and it's already ascertained in the first book that he's got a great affinity for languages. So he can speak Norse, he can speak obviously his native English, he can speak Latin, he can read and write Latin and Greek. So for him to pick up Arabic is not unbelievable. So but yeah, I've had to sort of write that in and explain it a bit. And even so, when he's there throughout the book, there's lots of times when I have these scenes where they're like creeping around in some sort of battle situation, and there's a Norseman, there's some English men, Welshmen, there's Hunlaf.
There's a joke in there somewhere.
Yeah, probably. And there's some Arabs, and there's a Frank. There's all these people together, and of course, there's sort of a couple of them can speak Arabic, so they speak to the Arab guy, and then the English people are saying, "What did they say?" And I have to write it in because I hate the idea that it just wouldn't. I try to put myself in that situation and think, well, you'd have to ask someone to translate, and I try not to slow the conversation. Try not to slow the book down, the action down, but you need to kind of have something in there that just is a nod to the fact that they can't all understand each other.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's the same with travel, because travel took so long in earlier times. Well, even as you said, 100 years ago, that the main form of transport was on your feet, basically. So in a book, you can't allow that amount of time that they would have taken to get from A to B. It would be extremely tedious.
Yeah, or you can, but you need to write something that happens around it, or you kind of do one of those, 2 weeks later, we arrived in Rome or whatever, so
Yeah.
you can, I suppose you can kind of gloss over it. And in fact, Forest of Foes, the ninth Benicia Chronicles, as Sharon said, is all set in France, in Francia, because they're traveling to Rome. But I'd never anticipated, before starting that novel, before sort of planning that novel out in detail, I'd never anticipated writing about the travel through Francia. It was just going to be a book about Rome, the next book. But then as soon as I started researching it, and as you say, you have to travel all the way down and searching the routes, and I discovered certain interesting historical events that happened at that time. And I thought, and to some of the characters, I thought, well, I have to write a novel around this. I can't just sort of not talk. When one of the actual sources from the time, which is the life of St. Wilfrid, throws up certain specific events that happened to Wilfrid in France at that time, I thought, I can't ignore that this has been given to me now on a plate. I have to now write a novel around these strange events that
Yeah,
that
it's
took
funny
place.
how that happens, isn't it? That novels get hijacked a little bit as you go into the the subject more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with historical fiction, maybe more than any other, because as soon as you start reading around the specifics of the subject, you think, oh, I can't ignore this.
No, no. Well, I mean, you started off with Bearbrand. Is there any of you in Bearbrand? Do you identify with him at all?
Well, Bearbrand is, big strapping warrior who all the women fancy, and he can sort of win in any battle. So obviously,
So you could be twins.
obviously, he's identical to me. No, I actually, no, I think he's obviously. I think most. Well, I don't know. I can only speak for myself. I think probably I identify with certain aspects of most of my protagonists. I guess you put some of yourself in. Or I put some of myself into all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting one. I think the closest I'll say is. So I don't think I'm anything like him in terms of character, really. I mean, he's got terrible anger issues, and he's had a horrible childhood where he was abused, and my childhood was not like that at all. It was idyllic, and my parents were very nice, and so really he's the sort of the typical troubled, flawed character, really, which is unlike me. But I do realize that I realized actually years after publishing the first book in the series, The Serpent's Sword, that there were certain elements of it, and I don't know how I hadn't thought about this before, but there were certain elements that were very autobiographical. So mainly in the fact that I had moved up to Northumberland as a child from Sussex, and I'd been bullied by the school kids. Some of the boys at school had bullied me because of my accent.
Yeah.
And then I thought, wow, this is interesting. I've created this character who's gone from Kent, so very close to Sussex, up to Northumberland, and he's only gone from Kent specifically because there were links to the Kentish crown, so it sort of made sense. Otherwise I maybe would have had him come from Sussex. I don't.
Yeah.
But and he goes up there, and then he sort of falls in with different bullies and horrible people, and instead of getting his head kicked in all the time, he turns around and fights them, and ends up killing all his enemies. And I thought, I wonder if that's just me living out some sort of fantasy of what I would have liked to have done to these bullies.
Yes.
Cool. I don't know. It was years later that I thought about this, and there's other elements to it as well. I think that first book specifically, I think, is quite. There's. It was literally the first novel I'd written. I know lots of people write, novels that never get published. That was the first novel I wrote.
Yeah.
And there are other things around it. So Bearbrand falls in with this crowd of, he's only 17, he's very impressionable and doesn't really know what he's doing. He's out of his depth. He falls in with a horrible band of brigands, really, after the first battle that he's in. And they're sort of roving the land in a sort of outlaws, really, and doing horrible things. And I think that reflects a moment in my life when I was in my late teens, and I moved out from my parents' house, and I started sharing a flat with a guy, an older guy. And not that we did any horrible things like that, but I think that influence of, and it became quite a toxic relationship, and I ended up leaving after a few months, and we had a big falling out. And again, it was years later that I looked at it, I realized that the Hengist character, this older, charismatic character that Bearbrand kind of falls for a while, was very much like me moving in with this guy who was much older than me, and sort of, and I could see a fork in the road in my life, where I made some difficult decisions that I could have made, and hopefully I took the right decision. But there was sort of, it got to the stage of, I don't know, there were drugs, getting, I don't know, it was just a bad time. And I sort of thought, I distinctly remember looking back and thinking that is a moment in my life that I could have gone left or right. And I thankfully chose the right way, which led onto a path of, reasonable success and normal life and getting married and having kids. And I could have easily gone down the rabbit hole and gone a different direction and have ended up in a very different place. And I think that's one of the things that kind of influenced that first book, and Bearbrand having this moment of having to sort of face up to what is, what's the way you want to go. Do you want to turn into this horrible character, or do you want to fight against it? And in his case, of course, he fights against it, and the rest is history. But I know it's a difficult read, that part of the book, actually, when there's some really horrific things going on, and Bearbrand doesn't really know how to respond.
Yeah. Well, talking of horrific things, what I'm quite interested to ask you, obviously people die in your book, some of them quite brutally, some close to Bearbrand as well. Now, quite a lot of people die in my books as well, so I'm interested to know how you decide who to kill and who not to kill.
You see, Derek decides it by, oh, Sharon likes that character, so I'll kill them all. So
Funnily enough, that's exactly the same way I decide, Sharon.
all I have to do is pretend that I like the characters I don't like, and I can get rid of them.
Absolutely, that's the thing. So you've told me now who you like certain characters, so you better watch out for them.
I'm very worried for kids. Is it Sinan or Kinnan? I'm very worried.
Well, I think it's Cunan or Cunan actually. Cunan.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Right, Kunan. Oh, I'll read it right next time then.
So really, it's the same root as Conan. I was originally going to call him Conan, but I thought it was too on the nose, so I changed it to Cunan. It's another derivative of that name. But yeah, I don't know the decision-making process. I don't think there's a very well. As far as I'm aware, there's not a very in-depth decision-making process that goes on. I think there's certain points in the series, or in a series, any series really, where it feels, for the type of books that we're writing,
Yeah.
and that you write as well, Derek, that lots of action and adventure and fighting.
Yeah.
It feels ridiculous that nobody gets hurt or killed. And I've also, looking back at certain books that I've read that have been very influential to me. For one that jumps out that I always mention is one of my absolute favorite books is Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. And in that, loads of the main characters die throughout the book. But it's incredibly cathartic and sort of, you get very up. I don't know if cathartic is the word, but it's very emotional. It really hits you hard, but at the same time, it feels very believable, and it ups the stakes for everybody else. It makes everything feel more real and more scary. So I know that when certain characters have died in books of mine, people have said later, "Oh, I really thought that maybe this was it, and maybe Bearbrand was going to die." Later on in the next fight, whatever. And I think without that sort of jeopardy, of really important characters suffering bad consequences and potentially dying, it takes away the edge of the rest of it. I think if one day there is a book where Bearbrand actually is killed in the book, people would be shocked, but they wouldn't be surprised. It wouldn't come as like a total shock to them. I don't think it would be like, oh my goodness, this is impossible. How could you kill him? Because he's in horrible battle situations all the time, and people get killed.
No, I totally agree. I think that's the route I've followed, certainly. Although I must admit, I don't know whether this happens to you, but I do sometimes almost change my mind or reverse what I was going to do. I was going to kill somebody and I decide not to kill them at the last minute, or even rewrite it.
Yeah, well, funnily enough, that has happened to me. I won't go into the details of the characters and because it would spoil things, but
no, spoiler alert.
but actually, in the first draft of one of the books, my editor actually said, this character that you've killed at the end in this fight, you shouldn't kill because they deserve a better death in a later book, which I thought was an interesting take. And when I looked back at it, I realized that, yes, it wasn't necessary for the stakes or anything. The stakes were already high enough. Somebody else had already died. It didn't need, somebody else to die. I didn't need to kill off everybody in the group. So I think the call was right from the editor. I think he'd seen that. I think he'd seen that you've already killed off some important characters. People have died. It's already pretty gruesome and gritty. You don't need to kill off people. And it was very much in almost the last throes of the battle. And I think it was anticlimactic, even though that might be very realistic, in that people do just get killed in real life in a fight. But yeah, I think it was the right call. So that's happened. And I think in this very latest one that I've been writing, again, I had a moment when I thought that I was going to actually kill a character off, and in the end I kind of relented myself. So I think my first sort of synopsis, I'd sort of said they'd die, and then I came up with a different solution to things. So
yeah, when we were talking to Ben Kane recently, he said he was, at the moment, he was actively trying to avoid writing too much fighting, because he said there's only so many ways you can slice, cut, hack, or whatever. And I sort of get that. Does that occur to you at all, or are you happy to?
Yeah, well, it definitely occurs to me that there's only so many ways of describing detailed fights, and I think sometimes. I think it was Christian Cameron who writes, lots of fight scenes, and he writes very well. And he obviously does loads of sword fighting and all of these things himself. So he knows all the sort of techniques. He was sort of saying that sometimes, the best descriptions, I think he posted something on Twitter or somebody else maybe did in response to his post about a couple of lines from a David Gemmell story. And David Gemmell does great. He'll do blow for blow blow by blow sort of battle scenes, but then he'll have other moments when and I think this example is like something, somebody entered a room and it said two warriors rushed him, they died. It was, and I think there is a moment when if you've built up enough action and there's enough description and stuff, you don't need to describe blow for blow everything. And I think that I can sometimes fall into the trap, I think, of trying to describe too much, but I think not just in fights. I think sometimes it happens, trying to get sort of too much detail in every aspect of a story, and sometimes you've got to step back and just say, they battled across the courtyard and killed several men and got to the other side. You don't need to describe every single blow.
Yeah, you have to sort of think, what is actually the point of this scene? What
Yeah.
Is it the fighting, or is it actually that they get somewhere?
Well, yeah, and most of the time it's about them getting to the other side of things and how things affect them. And then every now and again you want this really, I suppose, like in a movie, you want like the final sort of climactic battle scene, which is kind of blow for blow. But you don't need it in every fight. But yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to hear that Ben's doing that. And
I think after time we probably all do that.
yeah, I've done lots of things of sort of trying to work out what's trying to make fights different, and so I'll always be thinking about what can change in terms of the landscape or the weather or the weapons used or the different sort of situations. Can the warriors be injured in certain ways or be hampered in certain ways or have not have the right weapon or whatever, weapons snapping, weapons breaking. So there's all sorts of ways of thinking about making it different from other fights. So I get where he's coming from, that there's only so many ways of saying you stick a sword in someone.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing you can do, of course, is make the outcome the detailed bit. So you're not describing the battle, but the way in which you describe the outcome gives a few hints as to how things unfolded.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I have to say, I actually find the battle scenes and the fight scenes probably the easiest parts of writing. If I had to choose, the bits that were going to be the easiest and fastest to write, it is the fight scenes. And so I tend to kind of dwell on them, I suppose, maybe more than I should, because I think, well, if I enjoy writing them and they're easy to write, then probably that translates into when the reader reads it, that they flow quite well.
So do you have a favourite character, Matthew? Mine was Achenan, or is it Achenan?
Achenan, something like that. Achenan, according to the narrator, Barnaby Edwards, the narrator of the audiobooks, it's Achenan, and he's asked someone who's an expert, so he probably knows.
Right, so Achenan. And I still haven't forgiven you for that. I'm not going to do any more spoilers, but I haven't forgiven you for Achenan. So now it's Cunnan. I'm a little worried about his safety at the minute. But who is your favourite character? Is it Beerbrand?
That's interesting. I don't know. I don't know if I've got a favourite character in the Benicia Chronicles. I don't think it's Beerbrand. I think I thought about this quite a lot, actually. When you've got a main character that is a hero, action character like Beerbrand, sort of this flawed, troubled hero that tries to do the right thing, but it's always, he's a bit not exactly boring, but he's kind of the linchpin around which all the interesting stuff happens. I mean, he's involved in all the interesting excitement, but he's not the most interesting character to write, I think. And I think that's probably the case in many books where you have like a warrior type character at the center of it. So I prefer writing some of the other scenes, really. I liked in For Lord and Land the whole storyline with Cunnan. Actually, I did really enjoy writing that. So there's a sort of double storyline.
I really liked that. I thought it was a nice change as well, because I wasn't expecting it.
Yeah, and I try and do different things to kind of excite me and hopefully the readers as well. And I know some readers said they didn't like that, others said they really did like it. So you can't please everybody. But I liked that, and I liked writing some of those scenes more, I guess, than the Beerbrand scenes in that book. But it's interesting because I always write chronologically as well. So even though I'd done this split narrative, I didn't write all of Cunnan's story and then write all of Beerbrand's and then intersplice them. I would write one chapter of Beerbrand and then jump to the chapter of Cunnan and back, and do it that way. Which I think kept it fresh, and it means that you try to move quickly to the next bit, without getting bogged down or bored of it. So But I would kind of look forward to the Conan bits more, and I wanted to to get to the next stage there. So I did enjoy that. I think I've enjoyed writing some of the villains more. So Hengist was great fun to write because he's horrible. And I think probably for the sort of the goodies, the characters, I would probably say that I really enjoy writing Kenred, the monk.
Oh yes, yeah.
He's always fun because he's very sensitive. I mean, Bearbrand's quite sensitive, but Kenred's sensitive, but at the same time he's got sort of a bit of a hard edge to him. He philosophizes about things. But if I was going to say all of the characters that I've written, who's my favorite? I think probably Dunstan from The Wolf of Wessex. Actually, it's probably my favorite to write. My favorite character, really. I think it's probably it's probably my favorite character.
Is he going to remain a standalone then, or are you going to do another one with Dunstan in? Because I did enjoy that book.
Yeah, well, I early on, just after finishing it, I thought about writing another one and then my editor said, well, why don't you just leave it as a standalone for the time being? Because it's nice to have a standalone for people to jump in that want to sort of read your books. And I think that's the right decision. And a lot of people have discovered my writing through reading Wolf of Wessex, because it was successful and got some press and things. So it came at the right time, just at the beginning of lockdowns in 2020 as well. So, but I think secondly, because it's a standalone, so I think it's quite daunting for people to look at a series of books and think, oh, I've got to read 9 books in this. They don't want to necessarily buy the first book in a series of 9 or 10 or whatever it's going to be in the end. So yeah, I think I got to the point now that I'm a bit scared of going back to it and writing a sequel, because I don't know if it would live up to the expectation that I or the readers would have. So I think it might be best leaving it as a standalone, but I'll never say never. Yeah. But yeah, it's a funny situation. I've never really thought about it at the time, but now that a couple of years have gone by, I do have that sort of anxiety, thinking that if I went back to write another one, would it be as good? And if it wasn't, then you kind of tarnish the first book. You kind of weaken the legacy of that character. And I think maybe it's best just to leave it as it is and just make it a great standalone story that I'm happy with and most people seem to enjoy.
I mean, interestingly, when you'd written Serpent's Sword and you were writing the sequel, how did you feel about writing the sequel? Did you think, oh crikey, have I used all my good ideas up already? Or were you confident about it?
Yeah, I was a bit nervous about it, thinking that lots of my great best ideas had already been poured out into that first one. But I think because I was following sort of historical events, and also the Serpent Sword hadn't come out when I wrote the sequel, so that was the interesting part of that. So at the time I had an agent, and he was trying to sell the Serpent Sword to publishers and failing. But during those few months I was writing the sequel. So by the time I'd finished the sequel, pretty much I'd had all those rejections, but really it was written in the vacuum of not really knowing how the book was going to do, or lots of it was anyway. When I'd very first started looking at the Serpent Sword, I'd written a synopsis. Well, it was when I say a synopsis, a really high level sort of bullet points, almost of like, Bearbrand will go to this place and he'll fight so and so, and he'll kill this person, and this will happen, and he'll die at this battle or whatever. I had this kind of this sort of plan, and it covered his whole life until he was an old man, and I thought it was going to be one novel. So when I finished The Serpent Sword, when I realized that actually that was a novel length book and it only covered 6 months of his life, I thought, oh, better start writing the next one, which again covers just a few months. And so I had in the back of my mind that there were all these events that were going to happen. And so originally I'd had what happens with Hengist at the end of The Serpent Sword was originally going to happen in a completely different battle, which I'm trying to remember, I think it's the Battle of Macerfield in Warrior of Woden in the book number 5. And originally, I think I had that sort of confrontation going to be taking place there. But I realized that to make the book a standalone, I didn't want to have a cliffhanger. And so to make it a standalone with a good, proper ending, I needed to have a final denouement and confrontation with the villain of the piece, rather than, I didn't want him to linger and be sort of one of these characters that just lingers on as the villain throughout the whole series, because I find that a bit lazy, really. And although he's a great villain, you can maybe do it over a couple of books, but I think if it sort of spreads over multiple books for a long time, it does feel a bit lackluster from the reader's perspective.
Yeah.
You can have the bigger villain, you can have the big, I don't know, king or an emperor or whatever who's like moving the pieces.
Yeah.
But I think the individual sort of baddie that's the main antagonist for the protagonist is good to sort of have them have their comeuppance in some way.
Yeah, I agree.
Readers like closure. Yeah, I agree, because I mean, you get it on telly an awful lot these days, don't you? Where you go through an entire series and then the end of the series is a cliffhanger for the next one. It's like,
oh god, yeah. And I think I try to leave some threads that people can pick up and want to read next, where they're going next, what they're going to do next. But you really want closure for the main story arc of that book, I think, and of that TV series as well. I agree with you on that as well.
Yeah.
Right, so you have a new series now, which is, it has A Time for Swords and A Night of Flames, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
At the minute, set about 100 years after Beerbrand's story, just over 100 years after Beerbrand's story, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, it's probably 150 years after, something like that. Yeah, because 793 it starts, and Beerbrand starts in 633. So it's 160 years between the start of each.
So what made you start a new series that is 150 years after the first? I mean, I think if it was post 1066, people would see it as a totally different era. And yet I think because it's pre-1066, it's sort of, you look at it as all one period. But it isn't, is it? It had changed. Things had changed by that point.
Yeah, I think I naively thought it was all the same period as well. That's the truth of it. And so I was looking to write something new, and I wanted to write something in first person, just because I wanted to do something different. So it's always about challenging myself as much as writing something else. And so I thought I want to do another series. I think I had a conversation with I think it might be with Angus Donald at some event, and he'd said something like, "Oh, it'd be good." He'd said he'd wished that instead of just writing all of his outlaw Robin Hood novels, that he'd alternated between those and another series, and done sort of two series back to back, alternating between them. And I thought that sounds like a good idea. I'm going to try that, but I was just too scared really to jump to a completely different era. And I'd written Wolf of Wessex, which is set in 838, I think it is. So that's early 9th century. And that's sort of, again, early Viking age. So I'd done a bit of research about that period, and I was just a bit too scared to jump completely to a different era with all of the research that would entail. And I just thought, oh, well, this is only 150, 160 years later. I can, that's really, it's all the same. But of course, it isn't the same. And once I started,
I can wing it.
basically. Once I started writing it and researching it, I realized that there are lots of things that are very similar. But of course, all of the elements around religion have changed, and politics have changed, and and then I've got the characters actually traveling to different locations that I've never been to, and of course then you have to, it's all the politics in that area and all the stuff that's going on in that place as well. So there's a whole nother tranche of things to research. And so I decided actually changing to a completely different time wouldn't actually be that much more work. I think once you start moving location, like going out down to Islamic Spain, in this third book, I've had to research, and my research is not that in depth that like I could go and do a degree on Islamic Spain or anything, but obviously you have to read around the subject and try to understand what's been happening over the last few years, and what's going on there to make it feel authentic and get the right sort of lay of the land. And so I think really moving to any period in history would really have the same amount of upfront cost, I guess, to me as a writer, and having to research.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So will you do like Bernard Cornwell did with Sharp's Son, where he turned up in the Civil War books? Will you have a descendant of Beerbrand appear in these books?
Wow. Well, don't give me too much away. I mean, in A Time for Swords, which I'm pretty sure you've read, but there is a little mention of the fact that when he goes to Bebbanburg, Hunlaf actually says that he's heard, he's always been told that maybe, he's a descendant of someone, Beerbrand, whatever. So whether Hunlaf is or not, I don't know, but he comes from Ubbenford, Hunlaf does. So There's perhaps, and in fact,
you heard it here first.
yeah. So perhaps he is. There's a reason why he, when the Vikings attack Lindisfarne, while this monk, seemingly sort of pious monk, turns around and actually starts fighting them.
It's in the blood.
And that's perhaps down to his DNA. And if you look at all of the books, in fact, I think if somebody's really clever and looks carefully at all of the books, you could even find a thread through to Wolf of Wessex and perhaps a link to Bearbrand, but I won't give that away because nobody's told me what it is. So
I'm going to have to go back and read them all now again.
but I've sowed the seeds in one of the Bernicia Chronicles. I've sown the seeds of a connection to Wolf of Wessex, so that people that are very, there's a tenuous link there, but people could draw join the dots and say, oh, I see, that's how Dunstan is linked to Bearbrand.
Yeah, fabulous. I like that.
Yeah. So who knows? So maybe if I write in completely different time periods, I'll have characters. it will be like Blackadder.
I'd be tempted to do that.
Wilbur Smith did that, didn't he? He had the Courtneys in earlier centuries. He went back to that and so on. So
right, yeah.
It's possible. It's possible. I'm sure readers would like it.
Yeah, I liked having those little links in there. There's a couple of links in Wolf of Wessex one where at one point they hear some charcoal burners are singing a song, and I talk about the song, and the song is I can't remember what I call the song, but it's a song about a couple of characters from the Bernicia Chronicles. So there are things like that, little nods that if people have read the whole series, they'll get the links.
Yeah. I quite like Hunlaf, I must admit. He's probably my favourite character of yours. Why did you... I'm going off piste a bit here.
That's okay.
But obviously it's a kind of Magnificent Seven or Seven Samurai origin in a sense.
Yep.
What made you do that? Why did you decide to do that, to use that story?
Oh, that's a good question. I can't remember the moment that I had that idea, but I cannot remember the moment. I think it's just the fact that Seven Samurai is one of my favorite films. And when I started thinking about the book, I just thought, could I use that sort of, the fact that it had been retold in a Western setting, I thought, well, couldn't it just be told that sort of same type of story be told in a completely different setting?
Yeah.
And then when as soon as I had that idea, I thought, that works really well. And I went back and I at the early stages of that writing process, actually, I remember then becoming quite obsessed with Seven Samurai, and I watched the Magnificent Seven as well, and went off and I even there's a modern Magnificent Seven movies when I watched that. And I started getting really into it all, and I sort of thought, well, I know the Seven Samurai is the source material for the whole thing, the Akira Kurosawa movie, and so I watched that and I looked at it and I was really sort of analysing it, and then I realised after a little while, I had a conversation with my wife, and she said, you don't need to you don't want to just rewrite Seven Samurai as a novel. That's not what you want to be doing here. You sort of said you're inspired by it, then just be inspired by it. So that was very good advice from her. And so I sort of stepped away. I kept in one scene that is a real homage to Seven Samurai, which is the scene where in the Seven Samurai movie, one of the samurai shaves his head to look like a monk.
Yeah.
And he goes into a building to rescue a child that's being held hostage, and I've kept something similar, and that's very much a nod to the movie. But apart from that, I thought, step away from the film,
and
just get on with writing the book, based on that sort of that concept. There's a couple of other little nods in there. People would see to maybe the Magnificent Seven early on in the sort of the bringing together of the characters.
Yeah.
But then at that point, it definitely becomes my story, and it's very much just inspired by, as opposed to just a total retelling of.
Yeah, I mean, what it does enable you to do is to invent characters from different backgrounds and origins, which reflects the kind of people that might have been around in the period, which is quite interesting.
Yeah. So I liked the sort of motley crew idea of bringing people from and I like the idea. I think, you've got the British Isles, and I thought, well, hang on a minute, but like you said before, but there's a joke there. So I thought, well, I can have a Scots, I can have a Pict, I'll have a
Yeah.
a Welshman, I'll have an Irishman, I'll have an Englishman. So I did, and I thought, well, I'll have a Norseman, I'll have a Viking in there as well. And I thought I should probably have a female character as part of the seven as well.
Token.
Not a token, not token. She's not a token character in there. But I thought,
No.
as I was sort of breaking down this whole thing, I mean, the thing is, the likelihood of a woman actually fighting in the front lines in combat was incredibly rare. And I mean, there's a lot of talk in this sort of revisionist history we get at the moment. Lots of talkers like shield maidens and things. And I'm sure that there were a few, but it must have been incredibly rare. So I had to sort of create this situation where there is this character whose father had taught her to shoot a bow very well, and so she can join in with the defense of the village. But she holds her own, and she's a proper tough cookie. But yeah, so it was good just to throw and throwing a woman into the mix as well. Then you get that edge of do some of the male characters sort of fall in love with her, and you get this sort of a bit of an unusual situation where her husband's like thinking, what the hell's going on here? Why are you spending all the time with these warrior blokes? And because I thought that was quite realistic. She's like I've got to help defend the town, and he's like, screw that, you're not hanging out with all those rough warrior blokes, come and look after the kids, and cook my dinner.
Yeah, I did like that. I mean, I remember I think you've done on the Serpent's Sword. Was it a concept trailer or with a view to a film? Has there been any development on that, or is that still sitting, or can you not tell us?
Well, no, I can't. I can tell you because there's nothing to tell. So yes, we did this. We did a trailer. If anyone wants to see it, it's available online. You can go to theserpentsword.com or on my own webpage as well. There's it's up there as well, matthewharffy.com, and it's on YouTube. So if you search for it, you'll find it. But so we put it together with it's a long story really, but to cut it down, basically we wanted to try to fund or get funding for making a TV series of the Serpent Sword, the Benicia Chronicles, really, with each book, or hopefully being a season, as they call it nowadays. And I worked with some really talented people and a scriptwriter called Greg Stewart, who's also a novelist. He's got novels out there. So if you look for Gregory Stewart, you can find his stuff, and he writes plays and things as well. We did a treatment of it, and then he wrote the pilot script. And I was working with a small production team in the south of Wales, and we didn't have any money, so we wanted to do something that would make it more accessible and interesting for prospective production teams or streamers or whoever you want to pick it up. So Greg wrote a script for the trailer based on the first novel. So instead of actually filming the 9 hours of television and then sort of taking the best bits, we just wrote a script for a 2-minute trailer with multiple locations and all a huge cast of characters. We got all the people together. We filmed in multiple places all over the south of Wales and south of England. Got original music scored for it, and we got a BAFTA award-winning sound person. So she did the sound for it, and it's incredibly professional, really well put together for basically no money at all. Filmed over sort of 7 days in early 2020. And I think it looks amazing. It looks like there's some money behind it when there really was, just a few £100, and everybody did it for free, really. And then during lockdown, we had lots of movement on it in that we managed to speak to people that I don't think we would have been able to speak to normally.
Yeah.
Because everybody was stuck at home. That was an amazing moment, but I think we were a little bit unlucky that we hadn't got the trailer ready just before 2020. I think if we'd got it right at the beginning of 2020 ready, we didn't get it finished until sort of June. And I think if we'd had it out and ready in sort of February, March time, I think we probably would have sold it to a streamer because they were so desperate for content. They were all very worried about the content. And we managed to have those conversations. So we spoke to people from Netflix. We spoke to the production company that makes The Last Kingdom, and Downton Abbey and all those people. And we spoke to some people in the States. So we spoke to lots of actors and people. We did a lot of really interesting conversations. We were speaking to people who were holed up in New Zealand waiting to film the Lord of the Rings series, actors that said they would be happy to to appear in it. We got an agent in the States interested, but the reality is that it's just incredibly difficult. And after a long time and lots of sort of false starts, it hasn't really moved anywhere. So if there's anybody listening to this that knows a film producer, we still want to make it. And there's the first couple of episodes are written. There's a TV Bible we've pitched to different production companies, and it's all there basically ready to go. But obviously still a lot of work to be done. But it would be great to see it happen.
It really would.
I keep reminding myself that it's the books that's the day job, so have to get on with the writing.
I just think it'd be nice to have some historic television that isn't based around the Tudors. I like the Tudors, but they do seem to have it sewn up.
Well, yeah, and we were we really wanted to make it historically accurate as well, which is a real thing. And when we did have some of these conversations, it was a difficult conversation to have with different production people, because we said, we want this to be historically accurate. It's one of the sort of things we want to do. And A, they don't really have any interest in that. And B, they think that what they're doing is historically accurate already.
Yeah.
And are quite surprised when you say, like, I very much, The Last Kingdom, it's all great. It's great TV and stuff. But there's no way that those costumes and the stuff that they do it doesn't look right at all. And I don't really understand. And what I can't understand is why that is, because it's not like the real costumes, the authentic costumes would cost any more to produce. And it's not like they wouldn't look good either. So it's almost like a conscious decision to make it not real. And I don't understand it. That just sort of, for me, just becomes like a really confusing. It's a confusing question which I've never really got an answer to.
Yeah. So if it happens, have you got in mind an actor who might be good for Bearbrand?
Tom Cruise, obviously.
Really? He's too short.
I was about to say, isn't he too short?
No. It was that was a joke about the Jack Reacher movies.
Yes, that's right.
So no, I think probably the reality is, I mean, in the trailer, it was a young actor called Liam Hatch, and he was actually quite short as well. But it's very, he's a personal trainer as well, and he's really strong and fit. So you need to get someone who's physically able to do all of the stuff. I think is physically imposing, and really. Probably it would be a bit like the new Jack Reacher series, where you get an actor who has done some stuff before, but they're not a household name, but they embody physically the character more. And I think, Bearbrand could be like that. You'd have to be big, strong, imposing figure, really.
Yeah.
And I don't think he'd have to be a household name. And I think one of the things that actually would work would be to have a cast of unknown actors in it who could then become famous.
Well, of course, Uhtred was not the actor that plays Uhtred in The Last Kingdom was not by any means a household name.
Exactly. Yeah, I think you want to go that route where you get an actor that can embody the character and then becomes famous off the back of it, rather than a household name that kind of brings their own baggage to it.
Yes,
but it's an interesting thing, because within the industry, of course, it is those household names that get things made. So we were looking at the time, we were talking to different actors, and we were kind of thinking it would be great to get a famous actor in as a small role, as a secondary character, that we could maybe, I did toy with the idea of contacting Sean Bean to be King Edwin, as King Edwin gets killed right at the beginning.
Yeah, he's very good at that. He's very good at that.
Yeah, because I know that Sean Bean, I think, has said that he hates that he won't do it now because it's become such a meme. He doesn't like having these characters that get killed. So. But I did think it would be quite funny to get him on and then literally kill him in the first episode.
Well, you could have something like, say, David Dawson as Cunred. Mind you, he's a bit too old for Cunred, isn't he?
Yeah. But again, it's about getting these. I mean, again, David Dawson is a great actor, but I don't think he was that well known. When he did The Last Kingdom. Then they embody that character so well. So casting, interesting. We had a lot of discussion about casting. The Wolf of Wessex is probably the easiest one to make because it's a smaller cast.
Yeah,
and it's a isolated story. So you could probably it's much more like sort of True Grit. So you got this main partnership of the young girl and the older man.
And I like the idea of Dunstan being an older man rather than a young brash warrior. He's got a good head on his shoulders. I like that about him.
I really liked that.
It was funny. I had this idea exactly that idea about an older man, a young girl who comes along, and so on. And then I read Wolf of Wessex, and I thought, blow me down, there it is.
Well, I mentioned True Grit, so it's not massively
Yeah,
original.
no.
I guess it's been done before. And then, of course, Giles Christian went on to win the Wilbur Smith adventure writing competition or award this year or last year with a story. I haven't read his book, but the book is modern day. But again, it's a father and daughter traveling through the wilderness, being chased by baddies, which sounded slightly familiar. So I think it works. Having an older character looking after the younger one, and the growth of their relationship against adversity. So
I've moved away from that idea now.
well, if you're going to set it in the time of the Vikings or something, then it might be a bit too close. But
I've got one more question though, because we haven't talked about the fact that you are a rival to our podcast, actually, in that you're doing Rock Paper Swords with Stephen A. Mackay, which is absolutely fabulous podcast. I really enjoy listening to it. What got you two? I mean, you work really well together, but how did you two come about doing that?
Oh, thank you for the nice comments. Really, I don't know. I've never met Stephen face to face, apart from on Zoom. We've never been in the same room together. So we've talked though over the years. When I first started self-publishing The Serpent Sword, Stephen had just published his first 1 or 2 Wolf's Head novels, so just before me, and he seemed to be the guy to watch really and to follow at the time. So I did sort of emulate lots of what he was doing in terms of the way he promoted himself online, and I started talking to him online. I'd answer his posts and we'd speak, and we ended up sort of talking a little bit via communicator a few times, and over the years that just sort of became a more, it's funny really, sort of quite organically we chatted more and more via Messenger. Every now and again we'd see something funny or interesting in the news or about other writers or something, and he would post, so have you seen this, and we'd sort of have a little bit of a natter and a laugh about stuff, and we obviously got on on that sort of wavelength of sort of just joking about stuff and having a chat about things. And then during lockdown I did a few video live stream events because everybody was so desperate for content and just to sort of do something. I was so desperate to speak to someone else, and one of them was, and maybe I think might be the first one I did was with Stephen, and it was very relaxed, and we really enjoyed. Well, I think we both seemed to enjoy it, and we had a good chat, and people seemed to respond to it. And so then I'd been listening to podcasts over the lockdown period. I started listening really then, and walking the dog and listening to podcasts and stuff. And so it's sort of been in the back of my mind that would be, I'd like to do a podcast, but I didn't really want to do it on my own because I thought it would be a bit scary to be just the single, person. I sort of toyed with this idea of, maybe trying to do more for YouTube, do my YouTube channel a bit more. And I did a few more one-to-one interviews on YouTube and things, but I really kept on thinking that the podcast would be the way to go. And then what then sparked the coming together, actually doing it, was then Stephen early last year announced that he'd left his day job and was starting to write full time. And so I thought, oh, well, we're both writing full time. I think he contacted me and asked me a question about something. I can't remember what. And I said, and I sort of floated the idea because I think he was asking about, what were my days like? And did I find that I could write more, or did I struggle to find the time and things? And I think in that conversation, I sort of said, well, one of the things that it's quite lonely, writing full time. And I said, it would be quite nice to do something in collaboration with another writer. And had he considered doing something like a podcast? I kind of floated the idea, and then he was up for it. And then at that point, we sort of started discussing it, and that's it. The rest is history.
I enjoyed the episode with Christian Cameron. I thought you guys, I think, learned a lot from that one.
Yeah, well, we tried to work out what were the things that we both enjoyed and what would make it unique. And we decided, well, very much like you guys doing this podcast, you're both into history and historical fiction, so you've got your unique selling point is you're both published and successful. So we sort of looked at it and said, well, we're both successfully published historical fiction authors. We write action and adventure, and we both like rock music. I mean, he plays guitar and other instruments, and he sings. I used to sing in a rock band. So we said we really have these lots of sort of commonalities there, so let's just bring those together and talk about all of those things. And so it's been really interesting. and again, like you, we've had some great guests on, but we also do some of the episodes which is just the two of us chatting about different topics, and we kind of just going with the flow really and seeing where it takes us, and trying to sort of sit around these themes of rock music, history, and action and adventure, and that kind of covers pretty much the whole gamut really of what we enjoy. So we've had that crossover with music and history.
It seems to me, anyway, quite an original podcast in the combination of factors, shall we say, which I rather like.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew Harffy. It's been absolutely fabulous talking to you this morning. I've really enjoyed it. I haven't stopped smiling yet.
Well, thanks very much for having me on. It's been a real pleasure. It's really great. Always great to talk to you. Of course, I've met both of you before, back in the mists of time. Maybe one day we'll meet again at an event or something.
Yeah,
that would be nice. Thank you, Matthew. It's been absolutely fabulous talking with you. Really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you both.
Yeah, thank you. I look forward to meeting up in the flesh at some point.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks very much.
Okay.
So join us next time when Derek and I will be looking into Richard, Earl of Warwick, whether he was a hero or a villain. I know which side Derek's on. You'll have to wait and see which side I'm on. Thank you very much for listening today. I'm Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. We hope you've enjoyed today's podcast and that you'll listen again soon. Goodbye.